Hi, my name is Lisa Yates, and this is my dissertation defense. My overarching research question was, what impact did an experiential learning activity have on the disability perceptions of college stakeholders in a Southern California community college? Before I start, I'd like to tell you a bit about myself. My husband and I have raised four little women who have grown up to be smart, determined, and caring human beings. And I'm Gigi to two funny, creative, and kind grandchildren. When I began this journey, I was a disability support counselor at Mount San Jacinto College. And last fall, I became Director of Disability Support Services at Moreno Valley College, offering me a broader platform from which to advocate for students with disabilities. I've always been a curious learner and researcher, and in 2018, my passions led me to Notre Dame of Maryland's online PhD program. The emphasis on changing populations pulled me in because students with disabilities are a changing population that research shows is challenging to educators. History can provide us context as to why this is. Throughout recorded history, individuals with disabilities have been treated as other and less than, dependent on family or menial jobs, and at times not even allowed to beg on the street for survival. This is one of the many examples of ugly laws that were still legal into the 1970s. Be it enacted that on or after the passage of this act, it shall be unlawful for any person whose body is deformed, mutilated, imperfect, or has been reduced by amputations, or who is idiotic or imbecile, to exhibit him or herself in any public hall, museum, theater, or any public building, tent, booth, or public place. And whosoever shall exhibit such mental or physical deformity or mutilation shall be sentenced to pay a fine not exceeding $1,000 or suffer imprisonment not exceeding 6 months or both in the discretion of the court. City of New York, 1895. These perceptions are still part of our culture's collective conscious and unconscious thoughts, in spite of the work of disability rights activists, some of whom literally crawled up the steps of Congress in 1973 to pass legislation ensuring access to public places, including educational spaces. 21st century efforts by the United Nations declared that improving the lives of individuals with disabilities was the responsibility of governments, communities, and schools, who should increase disability awareness and understanding to reduce stigma. And they emphasized that individuals with disabilities should be included in this work. Also, the World Health Organization depicts disability as a diverse aspect of being human, because 1.3 billion people manage at least one significant disability. The challenge then becomes how to implement these global visions in a meaningful and respectful way. Enter my dissertation. These are the pieces of my dissertation puzzle. My research is significant because, in addition to those global imperatives, the California Community College Chancellor's Office has mandated that colleges must increase success outcomes for historically underrepresented student groups, which includes students with disabilities or body-mind predicaments. Serendipitously, in 2017, I created Beyond the Cover Living Books. I wanted to raise disability awareness, but also to empower students with disabilities to develop self-advocacy skills. My study used hermeneutic phenomenology and its offshoot interpretive phenomenological analysis to explore the perceptions of 21 individuals who attended at least one Beyond the Cover Living Books event. My participant sample included MSJC administrators, faculty, staff, a student, and some participants from outside of MSJC. The sample was racially and educationally diverse, and participants identified as either male or female. To guide my research, analysis, and interpretation, I used a hybrid theoretical framework combining David Kolb's experiential learning theory and Tom Shakespeare's critical realist disability model. My findings indicated that Beyond the Cover Living Books increased disability understanding, and so it succeeded as an experiential learning activity, and that disability perceptions are varied and complex. Utilizing a hybrid theoretical framework strengthened the credibility of my findings and helped me to bracket and check any biases that I might bring to the study. The hybrid framework also offered a holistic approach to guide my interpretation and analysis and to make connections across various parts of the study, producing a more complex level of understanding. Similarly, using a dual methodology offered another layer of meaning and validity to my qualitative research design. I used the dual approaches in this way. Experiential learning theory components provided structure for the analysis of beyond the cover as a learning activity, and I used interpretive phenomenological analysis in a spiraling process that connected the broader concepts of my literature review to my participants' descriptions of their experiences. In my approach to interpretation, I used the critical realist disability model to frame my participants' disability definitions because this model includes all of the traditional and current ways of defining disability. I relied on hermeneutic phenomenology to interpret and derive meaning from my participants' experiences because the hermeneutic circle provides an iterative process of reviewing, describing, coding, reviewing again, subcoding, interpreting, reviewing again, member checking, and revising as needed. This approach was used to interpret my participants' words for comparison and application to the experiential learning cycle. This is how the experiential learning cycle framed my data analysis. Beyond the cover was a concrete experience that my participants entered with a unique way of knowing or their apprehension. I theorized that their apprehension was comprised of their demographics, their level of prior personal and/or work experience with disabilities, and how they define disability. And so these were my initial interview questions. The next stage is reflective observation. I expected most of this data would come from their written post-event surveys, but my participants reflected often throughout the interview. Alice Kolb describes reflection as part of the recursive aspect of conversational learning. So the interview itself served as an experiential learning activity, producing new knowledge on both sides of the conversational space. The next stage examined how participants conceptualized the experience when it was over. Did they talk about it with others, make connections to prior knowledge, or ponder new ideas? And if they mentioned any behavioral or cognitive change after attending Beyond the Cover, this was considered evidence of active experimentation. The last level of analysis looked for signs of new apprehension, as both David and Alice Kolb explained that the deepest learning occurs if the individual experiences a new way of knowing about the topic upon their next encounter. The next part of the research question explored perception, and I found that all stages of the interview yielded important data about disability perception. Apprehension provided perceptual data as participants shared their background and worked to define disability. Perception came through again as they reflected on the different disability types, on the disability awareness event itself, and on particular living books. Perceptual insight showed up when they described how they processed the experience and if they described plans to implement new ideas or any new strategies they tried. This also provided perceptual information. And perceptual data emerged as they discussed their next encounter with either the topic of disabilities or an individual who managed a body-mind predicament. Sometimes I didn't have to search for or interpret their meaning, as participants would use words suggesting perceptual change like, I thought I knew, or now I understand, or I can't believe I used to think that. At one point, I thought I was finished analyzing, and I started preparing my work to submit what I hoped would be my final draft. But as I was reviewing and revising the first 3 chapters, I realized there were many connections between the literature review I'd completed a year earlier and my participants' shared phenomenon. And after discussing my revelation with my advisor, I began another level of analysis because I saw my participants' words as bearing witness to the works of some of the giants of educational philosophy. For example, in the 1700s, Catherine Macaulay wrote about the principles of benevolent education that supports society, and FF7 said this about the event. Beyond the Cover creates an environment to share in a healthy way with arms of support around the living books. John Dewey championed the power of experiential learning to produce deep knowledge, and OM3 said, I learned so much. The conversational format helps you to see the whole person, not just the disability. If you can move people toward that mindset, you did your part. Carl Jung posited that hidden generational memories and thoughts become part of our culture's collective unconsciousness, and STF2 wondered, why do I fear schizophrenia? I'm angry because how I think about schizophrenia came from somewhere. Paulo Freire recommended dialogue to explore abstract concepts, and FF7 described her experience this way. Conversations normalize people and increase compassion for ourselves and others. Holocaust survivor and sociologist Zygmunt Bauman describes humanity's fear of difference and the othering that fear can create. And OF5 admitted, I used to be frightened of someone with obvious deformities and severe disabilities. I would have looked away or ignored them. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote about humanizing discriminatory educational practices, and FF7 articulated that hearing challenges and experiences informs instructors how to work differently and add compassion and heart to the work they do, humanizing disability. Jane Rowland Martin is a champion of equitable and inclusive education, and FF5 is an attorney educator who is deeply involved in the work of racial equity. She said, this equity work is hard. It's hard right now. And this disability work needs to be part of the equity conversation in a real way, but it only comes up when we're talking about accessibility. She added that the work is not just about equity, what's beyond equity, inclusion and belonging. Without belonging, there's no such thing as inclusion and equity. It's all just lies. Dan Goodley is a contributor to the field of disability studies and education, and he writes about the concept of normalcy. Reflecting her view about normalcy, FF6 said, disability doesn't mean they're not normal. We're all different. We all have weirdness. I mean, I don't think people with disabilities are weird. We're all weird, or maybe librarians are weird. OF1 pointed out that we see the disability in others because we see what they have to adapt to in the world, but what we do to adapt is seen as normal. Goodley asserts that the presence of disability in education causes a divide because individuals with disabilities make certain demands on educational institutions and its members. AM4 reflected on his years as an instructor, and he confessed that, for me, just to be honest, as an instructor, I must admit this was something kind of I defaulted back to. I saw kind of in a selfish way students with disabilities as more demand on me or more work from me. And kind of that was my response as a classroom instructor. Finally, disability research, Allison Lombardi linked our experiences with disability to our disability perceptions. And OF5, who identifies as disabled and uses a wheelchair when needed, defined disability as something that negatively impacts participation with the world. And her experience clearly has shaped her definition because she said, at Disney World, I would have to use a wheelchair and people literally treated me like furniture. I was like, I'm not a piece of furniture. Stop climbing over me. Stop. Or they stand in front of us at the aquarium so we can't see anything. Next, I'll discuss the challenges, limitations, surprises, contributions, and future research for the study. I was challenged to balance my inquiry with some of the topics that came up during the interview and questions my participants would ask me. I learned to make note of them, to discuss them after the interview, but at times I felt like this restricted the conversational flow. Also, both disability and perception are complex and layered topics, and I wanted a free range of conversation. So, for the most part, I allowed participants to go off on tangents and share their thoughts and concerns, but that yielded a lot of data. I analyzed 1,156 pages of raw, unedited data. I also found it was really easy for the analysis to take me down interesting rabbit holes that were outside of the scope of my study. My advisor pulled me out of quite a few of them. Limitations included the fact that all participants chose to come to the event and so may have been more open to perceptual change. And I was only able to recruit one student in my sample, and she wanted to attend. Hearing from students who were incentivized by class credit may have revealed different student data. And the event took place in one college. It would help to see if the event has similar impacts in other regions or in a university instead of a community college. The ADA defines an individual with disabilities as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. And I assumed that my participants' definitions would align with that. But several of my participants tried to avoid using words like impairment and limit. AF2 said individuals with disabilities were able-bodied in a different way, and contextualizing within education, she said they learn in a different way. STF2 said we all have some disabilities, and I was also surprised by participants who define disability outside of the context of limiting major life activities, like OF2, who described disability as an approach to life. And others define disability as moving through the world as separate and different. Since some time had passed since the events, I expected that my participants wouldn't recall much detail, so I included their surveys and event images as prompts, and several said the prompts helped recall details, but most expressed deeper learning than I'd anticipated. OF1, who has professional experience in the field, said, I learned that people with TBI are more capable of doing things than we think. And several said they learned not to make assumptions. The last one I'll share concerns non-apparent disabilities. AM4 was previously a science instructor and very involved in statistical research in his current work. And he said he had trouble understanding disabilities that were unmeasurable, like ADHD. Regarding future research, the idea that some people think that non-apparent body-mind predicaments are unmeasurable is worth exploring, because this misinformation might explain some of the stigma attached to non-apparent body-mind predicaments. And my future research, I wish to explore the experiences of living books who have gone on to live their lives after the event. I believe that this study contributes to research on faculty disability perceptions, which may help educators lean into UDL and UDA. Also, experiential learning offers a way to implement those imperatives to increase disability awareness to equitize outcomes. And this study contributes to understanding the perceptions of non-instructional college stakeholders who can communicate welcome or misfit to students with disabilities, and administrators who make decisions about allocating resources. And the study offers experiential learning as a way to include students with disabilities in the work of addressing the uncertainties, misinformation, and culturally accepted biases that the normals bring to their interactions with individuals who manage disabilities. In conclusion, I agree with William Blake that if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all thoughts through narrow chinks in his cavern. I think my study shows that experiential learning, especially via conversation, can cleanse perceptual doors and widen the narrow chinks in our thinking so we can see the infinite possibilities in each other. And I think that if we want to instigate the kind of revolutionary change that can transform human consciousness about disabilities and the individuals who manage them, then the pluralistic environment of higher education is the place to begin this work. Thank you.